As we talk about the business of aviation, we should consider, hopefully in advance, how to prepare our airfields, our facilities, our staffs to be operational at all times, even when the conditions get pretty tough. So we're going to focus on how to prepare for disasters, to reduce the pain of such events, and to get back and running. And we were really fortunate to have 3 experts to help us, give us a short course and some do's and don'ts and some great knowledge on resiliency. So from left to right, we have Jeff Brooks. He is the Grid Improvement Communications Manager for Duke Energy of the Carolinas, a very important player for all of us. J.D. Solomon, P.E., is the CEO and owner of J.D. Solomon, Inc. He is an expert on many, many things, including resiliency and asset management. And then finally, we have Rob O'Neill, MBA, VP of Underwriting for Preferred Aviation Underwriters. Again, an expert in the field of insurance. Remember, their bios are on that app. You can read all about their criteria on that app and get to know them. They will be around if you want to talk with them afterwards. But rather than read the bios, we want to certainly dive into a very good and important topic. So to start this off, and as you came in, you should have seen a couple of slides. Again, that's not what you want to see on your airport or in your community, but I think that kind of gives a little bit of taste of if you haven't lived through a disaster or an uncomfortable scenario at your airport, it gives you an idea of what things could look like when you go out in the light of day. So to start us off, JD is going to start with his expert area and talk to us about operational resiliency. So I'm going to turn the attention over to JD.
Welcome. Glad to have everybody after lunch. It all starts with context. So I'm going to give you, I may sound a little bit more theoretical at times, but I've also worked a lot with boards. So I know I've got board members out there. I'm going to try to keep it kind of in that intermediate level where we can all understand it and not wander off into reliability talk, equations, squiggly lines. And I hope one of the things I do is really set up the conversations for Jeff and Rob as they get more detailed. And then, as Julie's mentioned, we really want you guys to ask us some questions near the end and really have an iterative discussion at the back. But we all start with some kind of context, and I wanted to bring a couple of my pictures for context. When I started as an engineer in 1987, young engineer in South Carolina, I was mainly working for airports, highway bridges like South Carolina DOT, and with the South Carolina Ports Authority, doing different things, construction, design, analysis, and whatnot. One of the first things that I called in on, we were working on the Mark Clark Expressway. It was just first being built down around Charleston, going to Mount Pleasant. And I got called out to say, the Bryn Sawyer Bridge is flipped over and we want your team to go out and take a look at it. And the first impression it makes on you as a young professional is, gee whiz, what does that reliability thing mean? What does resilience mean? Back then, it was a discussion of robustness, right? A term we've kind of lost. Resiliency has kind of become the buzzword, but robustness is still the word we talk about. And what does risk mean? And so I got to work on that project. It was about a year later that I was called out to pull in to look at basically where a train had derailed and run into a bridge. And one of the more interesting things about this was, as a young engineer, was I thought it was obvious that the train that's derailed midway through knocked over the bridge. But when the railroad got involved with a fatality, by the way, a fatality and a permanent disability, which was sad, the railroad came in and said, why did your bridge follow my train? And so we were out there trying to make the case. And again, sort out what do the terms mean? What do the concepts mean? What is, from a designer standpoint, as a young person, what am I going to be and what am I going to do? You can tell most of my career, I've been kind of the fix-it man, the oddball guy, the guy that does these kind of investigations. 15 years later, and I kind of set this up a little bit, I think for Jeff, was during all the stuff I did, I pulled this slide out because this was Western North Carolina. And if you remember when those storms came, Francis and Ivan, back in 2004, I worked on 6 counties in the West. There were airports, there were commercial buildings, there were roads, there were everything. But I said, my goodness, how could we have an impact from hurricanes way up here in the West? And you can. So this is not just an Eastern versus Western thing. This is everywhere we deal with. And I know Jeff is going to talk about that and Rob probably too, both of them in more detail in a little bit. And then finally, the one I wanted to share with you to give you context, because I do have Duke Energy here, talk a little bit about, but this was work I did in New Orleans. And this was post-Katrina. And most people say, didn't Katrina solve all those problems? And the answer is no. And when you live below sea level and you have equipment, that probably electrical equipment that should be in a museum. Pete Butler's here. I used to work with Pete for a long time, and we talked about some of the improvements in aviation, lighting on runways and whatnot. And it seems sometimes old and antiquated there, but this is stuff that was actually built by Westinghouse. The little engine that could on the far side there was built in 1915 and put online. It and basically a gas turbine engine, 20 megawatts. That 5 megawatts and the 20, they powered New Orleans for about half a year. And I was in the control center when Harvey took a spin to go to Houston. We were bracing for Harvey to hit New Orleans. And so then all this buzzword again, resilience, reliability, risk, what does it all mean? And so I wanted to share that background with you because it's not just specific to airports, but it is a lot of airports because it's a critical part of how we recover. And the expectation now is that the airports will be back online just like the power is going to be back online. By the way, some of you, if you're electrical side, I had never seen it. That is a 60 to 25 hertz frequency converter. In New Orleans, because the city provides 2/3 of their own power still, they're still on 25 hertz. And so when Synergy brings power in, it has to go through this very dangerous piece of equipment that sits in the open and change the frequency conversion from 60 back to 25. It's fascinating if you're electrical. So a couple of things I wanted to give you was the definitions. So what is this resilience? A term that's been hijacked by everybody from psychologists and mental health people all the way to emergency response and the environmental people. So what does it mean? Classic definition is a return to the normal state of distress. Now, as we run physical infrastructure, what we know is we design it, it ages, we put it in service, it goes down, we rebuild it, we do maintenance, we bring it back. We never quite get it back. We never quite get it back to where it was. And that's why we have to replace it sometimes, right? There is another definition, and we see that definition more, again, in the environmental world more recently, but you see it in fisheries and forestries and that kind of thing. We want to use the environment, but we want to be resilient where it goes all the way back to its normal state. It's a little bit different than our physical infrastructure, right? And that's where the buzzword sustainability gets thrown in. The Enviros wanted a different word than sustainable, so they threw out resilient. And what it basically means is we never deplete it. That's not the most common definition, but that's the one you'll hear from that side of the coin. And then finally, when we get into what I would call social issues and those type of things, and some types of physical system, there is a more recent definition to say that resilient means it decays, and when you rebuild it, you improve it as you rebuild. Now, as a reliability engineer, and then you guys that are consultants, what I would say that's a new basis of design. And we need to go back and redesign it at that point. We just don't kind of do it on the fly and call it design for resilience. That's already part of your basis of design and your reliability statement. But there are people out there that say we're just going to start correcting past ills with this definition. Now, I do strategic plans, I do root cause analysis, and the number one thing I find, so I'm going to give you some simple definitions, is when we start talking about these terms, and Julie said it, people don't understand what it means on the front lines. So I've got frontline people, I got board members, I got engineers. I'm going to give you the simple definitions. Anytime you see somebody say, here, resilience, in your mind, just say bounce back. You're up there, you're in that yellow zone, you may cross into the red zone on your gauge, but you pull it back into green. That is what resilience means. Keep it simple. We're just going to bounce back to our normal state. Simple definition. The definition of reliability is a long definition, like an item, system, component, does its intended function for a specific period of time under certain operating conditions. And that is your kind of your basis of design foundation. But when you hear reliability, just think uptime. Uptime good, downtime bad. Don't get caught up in reliability, availability, dependability, all those little variations, because engineers will confuse you with that, and experts like me. Just think uptime, downtime bad. And finally, the definition I give you for risk management is no surprises. When you hear somebody up here like me talking, blabbing around about risk, just hear me say surprises, because that is in the eye of the beholder, right? So when I say risk, think surprises. And if you don't think it's much of a surprise to you, then it's not much of a risk to you. That's an easy way to put it. So that's kind of demystifying those three terms for you. I felt so passionate, it's in my bio, but I wrote a little book about 5 years ago called Communicating Reliability, Risk, and Resiliency to Decision Makers. Now people say, why did you put that there? It's a better title. The subtitle is Getting Your Boss's Boss to Understand, right? And that's usually what people go to my workshops for, is getting your boss's boss to understand. But I wanted to keep reliability, risk, and resiliency in there because it is a very specific thing that in this world we have to be able to address and understand, no matter what types of infrastructure we're operating. If I was given a longer presentation on resilience, and we can ask this in question and answer, I'll touch on some of this, but 5 points I usually make, and I'll make them here. The definitions of I've stated are usually not well understood. Keep in mind in resilience, there is no time component. So it's in the eye of the beholder. It used to be called Myrtle Beach Jetport, one of the first construction jobs I worked on. We're working all night. A.A.E was a contractor. They struggled the first 2 weeks because the Air Force joint facility back then, Air Force and the commercial side had to check it off at 6. They barely made it every day. And I'll never forget what I was told by the general superintendent. Even though they were struggling and we were going to fail at some point, we weren't going to open back up, he said, if at least we're resilient. And I remember the Air Force officer saying, well, if that's what you call it, I guess. So it is in the eye of the beholder. I had one I did from Chapel Hill where we lost power, if you remember Super Bowl Sunday. Awassa lost water for 3 days. Not very resilient, except 2 months later, I actually had people say, hey, our system was pretty resilient. In 30 years, we've only lost water for 3 days. Well, tell the people that owned a bar on Super Bowl Sunday on Franklin Street, and they didn't think we were resilient at all. So there is no time component there. So you have to define that, unlike reliability in that. The calculations are not easy, and that's why I'm not going to go through them today in this short time. One of the things that I will say coming up with Rob is you can't transfer all the risk either. I hear this in a lot of places I go, we'll just buy insurance for it. Insurance fundamentally is for high consequence, low likelihood events. And you're making some bet that probability it won't happen, and they're making some probability that it will, or vice versa. You're making it will, and they're saying it won't. But that's all it's for. And as Rob will explain, you're only going to insure to a certain point. The rest of your base operation still has to be resilient, regardless of what that peak of insurance was for. So you can't insure your way out of resilience. It's part of what you have to do as an operation. And then whenever the event happens, it doesn't matter what else you've planned for, people go back to that basic need to protect my family, protect my job, protect myself, and then they'll listen to equations later. And I'll talk about that more in the book. I leave you with kind of 3 things to think about, and it's a balanced approach that I work with a lot of different industries and different airports and whatnot on, but these are the 7 things that you need to be resilient about, and they'll be in your slides. Physical systems like asset management, having your equipment fail, you need to be resilient there. Natural disasters, but there's also deeper ones, and you can read all 7. I'm not going to read them to you. The key is to be a resilient operation, you need to have specifically an integrated plan for addressing all 7 of these categories. It's not necessary for you to be 3 deep in natural disasters. The earthquake, the flood, and the hurricane, right? At some point that's repetitive, it's the same response. You may need all 3, but you better make sure you've got your information, your cybersecurity in place, your physical security in place, your reputational risk when your board gets mad at you because they don't understand and you have to bounce back from that. You've got to be ready in all 7 categories. If you're serious about being resilient, you also have got to be bold enough to get to the root causes. Some of you are pilots, so you know all that. Near misses, after action events. You need to be honest with yourself and not blame it on the lowest person on the food chain or the smallest pump or piece of equipment you got. It's usually a bigger managerial problem. And that's what you've got to understand. And this is my 5, but ISO 31010 has 7 steps. It's no magic in the steps. It's really how you do it. And so, but I would encourage you as you keep these slides, I've given you 3 tools under item 3 on the analysis. Use those 3 tools in everything you want to investigate, and you will be a more resilient operation. And I think the third thing I leave you with is what I call the resilience index. I've modified this over the years, but I've used it for about a decade for different things in resilience. But it really gets down to this. You can work on your physical systems, you can work on your communication tools, you can work on your connections, but you still have got to have an organization that's ready to be resilient, that's ready for that change, that's ready for that thing. And I know there's people in the back saying, we do natural disasters, we do the cowboy stuff great. Well, that's the short-term stuff, and everybody I've ever worked with does emergency response great. Everybody does emergency response great. Probably because that gets all the praise. The board gives them the praise, senior management gives them the praise, they pat themselves on the back, I pat them on the back. But that's not a resilient organization. It's the deeper things you've got to work on to truly be resilient. And these kind of questionnaires, we do the person, we do the program, or the department, or the whole organization, and then we do the whole organization. And so that way you can kind of see where those gaps are. So this is a tool you'll have, and it's something I'll give away to you. Keep it. Again, there's no magic in the questions, but it is something that it's a good tool for you to work through. So with that, Julie, I think I am done with my formal comments, and I will turn it over.
Thanks, JD. Again, I think that's really important because a lot of us are really good at acting on our feet, but the whole point of this conversation today is really to get ahead of that. And that really leads us into Rob and Rob's expertise. Again, what can we do, Rob, as an airport or as an organization to routinely look to in your area on how we can prepare for any type of disaster and be more resilient, the way JD was talking?
Guys about this, but let me start out with a very simple question. How many people in the room have actually read the insurance contract for their airports? Any one of the insurance contracts? 1, 2, all right. So I'm not, quick estimate math, less than 10% of the people in the room, probably less than 5%. So number one thing you want to do is you might want to have somebody look at that or read it. And here's the challenge you're going to run into with resilience and risk management. Is you're talking about airports from the general aviation to large municipalities. You may have somebody that has this as a job. It's highly unlikely that you have a person whose only responsibility is risk management and insurance. Okay, so you hire an insurance agent that's supposed to do that for you and work with them. The challenge is how do you take advantage of those opportunities to look at your physical plant. I'm just going to talk about the property side of it now, the physical plant of the airports, to make sure that it's up and running and it can withstand multiple types of disasters you might run into out there. We showed some hurricanes, we showed some floods. There's also a fun term in insurance, severe convective storm, tornadoes. How about severe winter storms, hailstorms? Hailstorms have done just as much damage, if not more damage to physical property in the U.S. than hurricanes have, because they happen every year. And unfortunately, the western third of our country right now is pretty much on fire again. That seems to be an annual trend that's going on over the last few years. So there's all types of natural disasters, not just hurricanes, you have to be prepared for. And what you can do with insurance and risk management, and insurance is not just what do you do after the fact. If you work with your insurance carrier and they have an engineering or a loss control department, if you don't have that in your facility, you don't have that staff, you don't have access to that resource, use your insurance carrier to come do that for you. Most people don't like to have an inspection done. I don't want you to come and look at my facility because you're going to find all this stuff wrong. You want me to spend a lot of money to fix things. Okay, one way to look at it, but also from a resilience standpoint, well, what's working well and what do I need to look at over the next X amount of time to be prepared for the next issue? We're going to talk about loss of electricity later. If you have no backup source of power for your airport in an area of the country which has a lot of storms, you might want to look at that long term. Is it worth that investment so that if the power goes out and the power company can't turn it back on in a day, do you have some backup power to keep your business up and running? Right, so think of insurance as a way to protect your physical assets, to make you resilient, and also to help you protect what is a valuable part of your operation. So let's focus on the pictures we saw. How many airports can run if they just lost all their hangars, lost their main terminal, and the airports are spread all over the airport? You can't run your operation, right? The other thing you want to think about is you want to be the first one in the game, right? If you're the first one to call your insurance agent or your insurance carrier after that bad event happened, you get their resources quickly. They come out and see you first. You don't want to be the 180th person to call after a hurricane, because now, as you guys know, those resources are spread thin. The first call's got in, they've got people out there looking at the facility. They're helping you protect it, meaning prevent further loss. And then their adjusters are out there pretty quickly. And insurance companies, believe it or not, actually want to get money in your hands quickly. So if you're the first one to call after an event, and they get their adjuster out there, and you get some remediation company that comes, you know, that they take the water out, put tarps on your buildings, protect them, protect your physical assets, maybe put some security around. The insurance carriers will get your money in your hands pretty quickly to help you get up and running and deal with those additional costs. What you want to pay attention to is, do you have the coverage that you need to allow you to do the things, put you back in play? And what JD said earlier, insurance can do certain things for you, but it doesn't do other things. One thing the insurance policy is not designed to do is routine maintenance on your buildings. So if you have had your main terminal and it's been around for 30 years and you've never replaced a roof and it's leaking, you're going to have damage, you're going to have to fix that. The insurance policy is not going to provide coverage for that. It's not meant to do that. It's not meant to replace your boilers, your heating and ventilation system every X amount of years you need to do it. But if a lightning strike hits a building and blows out the roof and causes a fire, then the insurance policy is meant to repair, replace, put you back in the same condition you were in before the event occurred. So I looked at some of the key elements of your airport you want to take a look at. Take a look at your hangars, your main terminal building, and one very important thing that sometimes I think gets a little bit overlooked is, how about your fuel depot and your fuel supply and the trucks that are moving it around? Because with no fuel in the planes, they're not going anywhere. So pay attention to that particular part of your operation, and do you have good coverage? And I'm not talking about the environmental impairment, pollution liability coverage. I'm talking about covering the actual fuel farm itself if something happens and you have to rebuild it, replace it, or if your fuel trucks have an issue and you've got to replace them. Very expensive piece of equipment, very expensive part of the operation, but really critical to what you do. A challenge with insurance is it can be expensive, right? And so if you're looking at your resiliency plan, if you're looking at your risk management plan for the actual airport, you've got a budget. You only have so many dollars to spend. One thing that we saw with the pandemic, and you see it after every hurricane or natural event, is the cost of raw materials goes through the roof. The cost of labor goes through the roof. It's nice being in a society where it's capitalistic. It's funny how people take advantage of that opportunity to get a reasonable return, or maybe a better than reasonable return on their work. We're seeing it right now at the airports, because if you go to rent a car, I don't know what happened, but the car rental costs are 3 times what they were before. You know, for $145, you used to be able to get like a nice high-end car. Now you get the Chevy Volt, and it's great, but you can't put a lot of people in it. So look at the cost of your buildings and try and be very critical in what your opportunity to participate in the loss. And I like to say it that way from the standpoint of, you can reduce the values on your hangars and your terminals. And I heard talking earlier this morning, there's a couple terminals, or I think where hangars going to be rebuilt, somewhere between $2 million and $4.5 million. Okay, let's say it costs $4 million to build a brand new hangar. And you've got hangars of the same size and shape of that one on your premises today. It's very difficult if you're going to insure for $1 million, because it's going to save you maybe a couple $1,000 on your insurance premium. Makes sense with your budget, got to manage the cost. But do you have another $3 million sitting in the bank somewhere that if that thing goes down, the insurance company goes, yep, you had a loss, it's covered, here's your check for $1 million, and they walk away? It's going to cost you $4 million to build it. Where's the money coming from? How can you get it built? So keep an eye on the actual value of your assets there. Now, you're covering for what you need to replace them. Because insurance policy is meant to replace the buildings for you, rebuild them. So don't shortcut it from that perspective. Insurance agents involved with that. They can help you look at the valuation. They can help you figure that out. And it's all part of that overall cost and resiliency. So focus on what are the key assets. Because some assets you might go, it's useful life, as JD was saying, it's just about over. If it goes down, that's fine. We're not going to use that anymore. We're going to do something over here. It's going to be new construction and all that. And insurance carriers, by the way, can also provide the insurance on the new construction. So if something happens while they're building your new hangar and it goes down, you got the money to rebuild it again. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're looking at the insurance. The other thing that the insurance companies can do for you, if you don't have your own risk management team, you don't have somebody responsible for that, is they have all kinds of wonderful things. So they have a bunch of actuaries and a bunch of engineers on their side, and they love lists. So we pop that list up on the screen. So they have checklists. Yeah, that's just not showing up there. So it doesn't present well on the slide, but basically, if you don't have a resource in-house, ask your insurance agent and your insurance carrier, do they have a checklist? In this case, it's a hurricane preparedness checklist. It covers a bunch of things JD was talking about. It's going to cover a few more things that Jeff's going to be talking about. basically what you want to know is before a bad event happens, what do we need to do? What do we need to be prepared to do? I think right now, if hurricanes are coming through Carolinas, everybody knows we can go somewhere, get a whole bunch of sandbags, and probably protect our property. That's been done enough times that people kind of say, I know what to do with that. But, okay, what if all you lose is the electrical grid to the airport? What do? What if you lose the fuel farm? What if one of the fuel trucks driver has a heart attack and drives into the fuel farm and it's gone? Okay, now what do? What's the backup? What's the plan? Do you know what to do first? What to do second? Who to call? And it goes along with what I was saying earlier, is that you want to have a plan in place that I know the number I got to call for the insurance agent or the insurance carrier, so if the bad event happens, I want to be first in line. A lot of the carriers now, because there's been so many hurricanes or natural disasters with wildfires and all that, they'll pre-position people. So if a hurricane's coming up the coast and we got another tropical depression coming across, which looks like it might make, panhandle of Florida next week, if it looks like it's going to be a hurricane coming to the coast, the insurance companies will actually send their adjusters down there. They'll pre-position them all around so that they are really close and can actually get there quickly. They'll use some of the cool technology we have now with the drones. Instead of sending live bodies in, they'll take the drones and fly over to see the damage. But you want to be first on the list. You want to be the first one to call, make sure they get to your property first, help you preserve it, help you protect it, and help you rebuild it. Sad part is, and we heard about it a little bit today, COVID was one issue, but just, COVID's one thing, but a hurricane's another. Okay, say you lose your main terminal. Insurance company, and you have enough coverage for it, and the insurance company's got the money to give you the check. How long is it going to take to rebuild it? It's not coming up in a week. It's not in 6 months, right? It's going to take X amount of time. So you always have to have the other part of that is how do you run your operation if you lose a critical piece of your infrastructure, and what's the game plan for there? Can you rent some space somewhere else? Can you run your operation slightly differently? So insurance is a great thing to help you recover your assets and replace what's lost. It's just not fast when you're talking about buildings, your fuel farm, your hangars. It just takes a little while. So, all right, I think that's good. And then from there, I'll let Jeff talk more about the electrical side. So, thank you.
Thank you, Rob and JD. Coming off the Olympics, I guess that makes me the anchor swimmer, which I've had some good heats before me, or whatever you swimmers before me. So I'm Jeff Brooks with Duke Energy. I'm really pleased to be with you today, not just professionally, but I always think nostalgically about airports. I know they're practical to you, but for me, when I was a kid, my greatest bonding memory with my grandfather is every Friday night going out to the Hickory Airport. Anybody from Hickory here? I don't know if they are today. Hey, Hickory. Out to Hickory Regional Airport, watching the planes land, and I remember walking in the terminal, and it was night, and it was always on. There were always people there, and it always struck me, even as a kid, that the airport never shuts down. The airport is always the airport. Every kind of weather, every kind of hour, if somebody needs to get there, they're an essential service. So years later, I worked for Duke Energy. We're an essential service. And so we have a lot in common when we think about the work that we do. Our communities depend on us. Our communities expect us to be reliable. They expect us to be functioning. And when a disaster strikes or when an incident occurs, the expectation is you get back up quickly. Okay, you've heard some of the speakers talk a little bit about resiliency and the things that we have. When it comes to my business, I think about all the things that make the power go out. And your first thing is we've thought a lot about storms. Storms are my thing. I'm the senior storm person for our company too, so I love storms. I don't know if you love storms, but I kind of love them. I'm sorry. But that's one thing, right? In the first quarter of 2021 in Durham County, 50% of the customers who experienced a power outage experienced them because of cars hitting utility poles. The other day, we had a big high-profile outage, and it was about 5,000 customers that were out because of a squirrel. Bad day, all right? And let me tell you what, the news loves outages caused by squirrels because they got all kinds of funny footage they pull out and make fun of it, So it's there. We've seen in February, Texas, massive outages due to the inability to keep the generation system running in extreme conditions, okay? We see all the other things, the wind. We see physical and cyber threats. We're in the process of making our energy grid smarter. All the things you hear, you want cleaner energy, we're working on it. You want this and that, we're working on it. But it means more data points, more communication points, all of which have to be secure. And we're distributing technology. So we're going from the place of power plants that used to send power one way down the energy grid to now having power flowing in all directions from your rooftop, from a battery storage, from something else. All these things are changing. What I would probably suppose here as I talk to you today is that some of the same things are happening in your business as well. Customer needs are changing. Threats are changing. We talked about storms. We're going to talk about that a little more because storms are a huge part of our culture in North Carolina, and they do affect our ability to do our jobs, as you can see in the picture there. Our focus really is around 4 key customer areas, and we'll talk about those in the relation to your airports as well. Improving reliability. Okay, the tolerance for outages has gone, okay, and the pandemic made it 10 times worse. Because everybody expects that service to be there, and they need it. It's no longer a nice to have, it's essential. I would argue many of the functions you have at your facilities are no longer nice to haves, they're expectations, so being reliable is really important. We're strengthening the grid. We know that weather is getting worse. Our data says our storms are getting more frequent, they're getting more severe. We've had 2 500-year floods in eastern North Carolina in the last 5 years. We had a 100-plus year flood in western North Carolina, just north of Charlotte. This is not a place you get to hide from. It's real. So we are trying to strengthen our systems to make them more efficient, and you have to do the same. We're expanding to cleaner energy options. Our customers expect us to be more sustainable. Our customers expect us to do things better than we did before. I would imagine most major corporations, most facilities, most communities have sustainability goals, resiliency goals. Ours is to be net zero carbon by 2050. That doesn't happen without investment. That doesn't happen without improvement. That doesn't happen without changing the way we think about our system as a whole. And then, of course, our customers want more options and control. I did some looking around on some websites of some of your facilities, and I just flew through Charlotte yesterday. We were just talking about it on my way back from Florida. And, we've all got our apps, we've all got our screens, we've all got our information. Even if you're a small local airport, people want more information, and they want it handy on their phones. So with all of this in mind, it creates a lot of pressure for how we manage our operations, and we have to do them perfectly. JD talked a little bit about the definition of resiliency. I want to talk a little bit about that as well. We kind of group our improvements into 2 categories. Strengthening. So strengthening would be making the system more able to withstand disruption, making it able to be more reliable in a variety of extreme conditions. That can include anything from, for us, pole and line upgrades, to placing lines underground, to adding greater capacity on lines to withstand high winds like we do in Wilmington and up the coast, all the way to building barriers we'll talk about for flood protection, because we've had some of our essential systems become inundated and taken out of service. Contrast that with resiliency, which, as JD mentioned, is the ability to recover quickly when a disruption occurs. So we have systems that do both. We talked about flood protection. Again, we've had 2 500-year floods in eastern North Carolina and 100-plus-year flood in western. For us, what that meant was more than 9 substations got impacted, actually close to a dozen, by crippling floods. The one you're seeing there is Grifton. And Grifton is just one example of several where we've actually gone, and this substation was taken out not just once but twice, Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Florence. Takes out the entire community, right? This is an essential system. We have substations near all of your airports that supply you with power. Some of those may have been affected by the substations. We had Whiteville, big substation that was hit up in that area, regional substation. So we've gone in and actually built flood barriers around those areas that are in flood-prone regions. That's an 8-foot high-density polyethylene wall with 18 feet underground to hold back massive amounts of water. Why is that important? Because if that substation gets taken out for 2 weeks, no matter all the repairs I make, they're still sitting in the dark because I can't get that one piece of essential system to work again. So I want to ask you real quick, when you think about your facilities, tell me quickly, just you can call them out, what is the one thing or 2 things that you cannot live without? Power, but, okay, what else? Electrical? Runway. Kind of good to have a runway. Data. What? People. I've heard fuel. I've heard other things. You know, you have systems that keep your facility operational, and if that system goes down, you're out of business. So my question for you is, as we talk about this, is when you think about that one thing that can never go down, what are you doing to protect it? How are you thinking about it in your planning? That's one of our one things. If we lose a substation, all the repairs in the world don't matter because the power is not getting there. So we're also thinking about resiliency. Resiliency, that ability to recover. We're building a smart thinking grid at Duke Energy, and a lot of those are around airports and essential facilities. What this system does, first of all, is it looks at our essential systems and it monitors the health of things like transformers and says, that transformer is going to need replacing, so that we can proactively schedule and work with you and others to do a planned outage rather than you losing it on a Thursday morning at 9 a.m. when you've got a lot of activity at your facility. That same technology is also allowing us to reroute power. This is what we call our self-healing technology. So I want you to think about a GPS in your car. You're driving along, GPS says, hey, there's an accident up ahead. Well, you can either sit in traffic for 2 hours while you wait for that accident to clear, or you can take this road, go right around it, and we'll keep you on your way. Self-healing technology actually does that with the power grid. It identifies opportunities to reroute power around outages that we detect, and we can reduce the number of customers that are impacted by that outage by about 75% and can restore power in a few seconds as opposed to hours. We're going to put this on 80+% of our main power lines over the next few years, which means your facilities will benefit from these types of technologies. But again, I ask you, when you think about your facility and you think about how you receive power today, and you think about that one thing you can't afford to lose, if it involves electricity, what are you doing to protect it? Does that mean you need a second feed into your airport, that we could reroute power as we've done at some of the major airports around the state, so that if we lose that main line, there's other ways to bring power in? Does it mean having generators so that you can switch to those? What is your self-healing proposition? And if you need to work with a utility, have you thought about that communication process? Because we want to help. We have account managers for most of the facilities that are here probably, and we have other representatives. But as we mentioned before, I think Rob mentioned it, you can't wait until the day the hurricane's supposed to hit to decide that you need to make those improvements. If you're planning an expansion of your airport, if you're planning to beautify something, if you're planning to do something different, make sure you include that account manager so they can begin to have those conversations with you. Would also say this was a good tip given to me by one of my teammates. They said, you know what, we work with a lot of airports that have generators, but they forget to plug things into the red plug in the airport to make sure that it's turned on when the generator kicks in. There's a lot of low-cost, no-cost things you can do that'll get the most out of that generator. And I'll tell you about one more really cool thing. Battery storage, microgrids. This is kind of the next frontier, right? So if you're thinking long-term planning, this is a big one. This is a utility scale one up in Hot Springs where it's a 4 megawatt capacity. And what we're doing there is the town of Hot Springs didn't have the ability to have another line run to the town because of geography. So this serves the same function. If an outage occurs, a tree falls on that main line, this system can come on and island that community and keep it operational until repairs can be made. It also helps to keep power quality higher in the event that there's fluctuations, which we know is very sensitive at airports facilities. Even just a slight flux in voltage can reset systems, it can cause challenges, and that can disrupt productivity as well. This one is solar powered, so we're using solar energy. It's off the grid there that it can do that, so we can turn the system over to this if needed to operate that town for several hours until we're able to make repairs. Now that's the big scale version, but hospitals have them. Airports can have them. They make small scale versions of them that you can think about as you begin to plan your processes for the future. Be imaginative. We can help consult with you and talk to you about that because there are options that can help you to do that. Now, I want to think about that for just a second in my last closing comments. I've talked about several things here at your different size airports. I recognize that large metro airports have more budget potentially to be able to make those big changes. But I think there are things that you can do at any size and that we will do to help you as well. On our end, we're out patrolling lines near airports. We're looking for potential hazards. We're doing LiDAR scanning. We're doing other types of analysis. If we can identify opportunities to make improvements, we'll build those into our grid improvement plans. If you're having reliability issues or voltage sags, reach out and we can work on reliability plans to help you. All of that is pretty much on us. You also can make plans that we talked about, but the key thing is you got to think about it in advance. And we said before that some people have dedicated resiliency managers. You know, I would argue that every facility has to have a resiliency manager, even if it's just one of your many great roles that you're so good at. Because if we're not thinking about this, if we're not planning ahead, if we're not contemplating a world where storms are getting worse, where more electronics and more smart technologies can be disruptive, where we do see entire airports shut down because of ransomware attacks. All of these things mean this is not just a nice to have, this is part of doing business. This is part of being that airport that little Jeff comes into when he's a kid and they say, you're always open, you're always here. Those pilots count on you, the city counts on you. And I would say to be creative in your thinking. If there's ways that maybe you can't, by your own budget, fund that. You know, one of the things we've talked about with some communities is looking at resiliency pockets. So it might be this particular area of town is our resiliency pocket. And we want to build self-healing there. We want to underground some lines, whatever we need to do so that you can put a shelter there, so that you can have a staging site there for emergency services, so that other partners can become part of that equation and can help to fund that process. Be creative in how you think about it, and I'm sure you can find solutions. And our folks would love to be a part of that conversation if you do have an account representative with us. Regardless, you know, find what's right for your size, find what works for you, and together, we essential service providers can help to keep our community strong when disruptions occur. I'll turn it back over to you, Jill.
Thank you. So I think Jeff brought up a really good question that I want to pose back to the panel. Since we now know what reliability and resiliency is, we've heard about the insurance. So Jeff said it. So if the three of you were going to give a piece of advice to an airport manager or an airport board, and they had some extra money or they had time to focus on something, what is the one thing that you would recommend to them to help the airport be more resilient, especially on the planning side?
Right here, I'll go first and just say, kind of reiterate what I just said. We have account managers and representatives with the company, reliability engineers, that would love to talk about situations that you may have. And if you've got current reliability issues, let's address those. But as you think about your long-term plans and what your power needs would be, certainly bring us in as early as possible into that discussion. But I also come back to the notion of identifying what those things you can't live without and start thinking about how you can narrow your focus. You think about, I use this analogy a lot, which is not a great analogy, it's kind of morbid, but if you ever jump in, cold water and you think about hypothermia, you remember what it does? It protects the vital organs so that you can stay alive. Your fingers might go numb when you're cold outside, but it's keeping your heart warm. You got to keep your vital organs going. There's other things that don't have to be on. There's other things that don't have to be resilient, but I guarantee you there's a few things that absolutely must be. And identifying those and planning early would be important.
I think it's the combination, that slide with the 7 categories. I usually start there. That's probably one of the biggest demand. Let's look at those 7 categories. It's a little bit what Jeff said. What's the one thing in each category that you're most concerned about? And let's walk in and look at, and then you get into reliability block diagrams and fault trees, but let's figure out where the choke points are. Where are those single points of failure, and then start mapping a strategy for those. And I think that's the biggest thing you can do is figure out the 7 categories, the hot spot in each one you're concerned about, and then where are those single points of failure, and get a plan, as we've already talked about, to resolve that.
And then from an insurance standpoint, it's kind of a two-part answer. look at what can you do to preserve your physical assets. So that tends to be a loss control, risk management perspective of can you upgrade, maintain, or replace something. And think of a lot of HVAC systems are pretty good, the boilers, the electrical work, your roofs on your buildings, right? Can you make, because you want to protect your physical assets. The other part of it is, if you got some money to spend, is what are your most valuable assets? What are they worth if you had to rebuild them, replace them, or buy them today? And do you have enough insurance for that? As I said earlier, it's easy to say, oh, I got X amount of dollars to spend, let's just lower our values. We don't have, as JD said early on, you don't expect to lose your building every year, right? The buildings don't burn to the ground every year. So we say, it's cat cover, right? It's basically a bad event happens extremely infrequently. But when it does happen, do you have enough money to rebuild it, replace it, or repair it? You don't want to be in that hole we talked about earlier where you go to build a brand new hangar and it was $1 million last year, you go get the guys this year, now it's $3 million because all this other stuff happened. And where are you going to come up with the extra money? So that's the one thing I would spend some money on. Just make sure your coverage is adequate for what you're willing, what you need to replace it, or you're making a conscious decision to accept that additional probability. You have to come up with a lot of money. So.
Well, and then talking about asset management and the checklists for preparing or looking at, how often should airports plan to do that? How often should you review those asset management lists and those checklists?
Ideally you do it at a minimum once a year. Look at it, and if you want to tie it to when you have your insurance policies come up for renewal, good time to do it because you're talking about it anyways. But once a year, what's the plan? What do we need to do to adapt? Are we in a position to respond should some bad thing happen? And are we in a position to replace or repair or find alternative space if needed, if we have a loss that occurs? So at least once a year you should be looking at it and stay proactive. A little different than the whole pandemic thing with CDC where you're changing the rules kind of on the fly. If you're doing it once a year and you have somebody who's responsible for maintaining that, and again, as I think we talked earlier, it's probably 1/24 of a lot of people's jobs. It's another thing you get to do in addition to your day job. But at a minimum, once a year, just look at that, make sure you've got everything in place, and have it handy. I mean, you can't set it up. Put it in front of you. Put it on a desk. Put it on the on the billboard you got in the kitchen or wherever. But have it someplace it's easy to find, because when bad stuff happens, you don't want to go, it's in a file cabinet, but I can't get into the file cabinet because that's the room that had the fire, right? You don't want it to be there.
I would say I would agree. I usually look at the equipment list every 3 years and wholesale look at condition about every 3 years. So do a lot with asset management. The two pieces that people don't look at all or not nearly enough, and I think that the point there is the insurance policies. When I walk in and say, when I do my asset management plan, we're a bunch of gearheads, most of us, so we look at assets and condition. You can't build a 20-year forecast without knowing what something's worth. And so one of the first things we look at, in addition to what we think it's worth from the purchase records, is what are we insuring it for? And that piece right there, we're never insured right with what we think the value, the replacement asset value is. So that's one area that I tell people you probably need to look at every 3 years too. It's out of your asset management program most of the time. The other part was what Jeff talked about, was I can't tell you the number of times that I go into any type of facility, airports or otherwise, and say who's taking care of the generators and what's in my world, the Gregory Pool contract, and nobody knows. And so you have this maintenance plan for your own people, but you're not putting that same conditions or even knowing what the other people are doing. Those need to be looked at every 3 years. So 3 years on the asset list and condition, rotating, at least every 3 years on the insurance and what you're insuring things for, and at least once every 3 years for those vendor, because you think you're taking the risk off, but if you don't know what's in the contracts, you're not pushing that risk to anybody else. You've assumed the risk yourself. So.
And I would just add, many of you I know, because I've talked to the account managers, have regular meetings. It can be quarterly, it can be semi-annually, whatever's the right cadence for you. With Duke Energy to talk about what's going on. And I think about from the standpoint of you're going to add a new facility or a new hangar or expand a terminal or add a new whatever. And you do it and you do all that stuff, but what it's also doing is adding more load onto existing circuits that serve that airport. So if we know your long-term plans, we can design our system so that if we need to add more power feeds into the airport to make sure we can spread that load so that when that one line goes down, you don't lose 3/4 of your facilities. That only is done through planning, and it takes a while. So I would say some kind of regular cadence. I do recognize that some of the airport facilities in here may be served by munis and co-ops as well. And if you are, or some other aspect of it, they have their representatives too. So I do encourage you to establish that relationship, because this is what they live for. And they're really fun people, most of them. They're kind of good. So they'll probably take you to lunch. So there you go.
And then talking about, although we know that Duke and our utility providers do everything they can to reduce the downtime, generators are a big part of what we do. Either a standby generator or smaller generators. Some of us have a cadre of all of them. How often, and especially from an asset management perspective, and needing them when Duke is offline, how often should we look at our generators and plan for generator replacements?
Well, two different questions. I think
Yes.
you should be looking at your generator records every year to make sure your maintenance is being done. I think the thing we leave out is you will have third parties do a lot of your generator maintenance. They like to tell you when something's wrong, but they don't give you the pictures of what's right. Get their thermal images, get all their data, and so you can have it in your records. There's no reason not to have it. They did it for you, you paid for it, but get it all so you can look at that on a if not yearly, again, a 2 to 3 year cycle for that information. I will say this about generators, and these guys may have different. You used to build a generator, and I know the generators were, people had told me 15 to 20 years when I started my career. There's a lot of generators out there that got 30 years out of them. So, all kind of things, transformers, everything. You're not going to get that anymore. And so you're down on transformers probably, if they tell you 17 years, it's going to be 17 years. And a generator, 5 or 10 years, it's going to be 5 or 10, whatever they tell you, because we've gotten better on the reliability side. We don't overbuild them anymore.
Right.
And so you nearly need, that's a big thing when I work with boards, is that we just replaced that 5 years ago. And you go, yeah, but you replaced your TV set too 2 years ago.
Yeah.
It's not that staff's doing anything wrong. It's just, this stuff is just not built. Now, it's cheaper too, so there's a part of that equation, but it doesn't last as long. And you really need to get that message out to your board and to your.
Yeah, I would think that as well, just because we do ourselves. We inspect transformers. We inspect a lot of the other connecting points and other equipment on the system. Your brain typically will drive in on the major piece of equipment. It'll be like, that's the thing I got to keep an eye on. But there's lots of components and parts, within the system itself. And so making sure that all of that is working well and testing it, making sure you're actually deliberately going through and doing those motions, I do think will save you a lot of pain. Because we were talking about this earlier, when you're in an event and the generator doesn't work, it's not so easy to get parts and equipment there quickly to get it back up. So.
And one piece that gets overlooked a lot, right? You're talking about insuring your hangars, insuring your terminals, insuring your fuel farm, but you also make money running your airports, right? So there's a loss of revenue or business interruption. One thing most people don't understand is that the typical deductible on the loss of revenue or business interruption on a property policy is 3 days. So if you don't have that backup generator, you're down for 3 days, what's that going to cost you? And that's in your risk analysis, right? How much would a generator cost versus 3 days of revenue? So just keep that in mind as you're looking at what's the pluses or minuses. If you generate a lot of money in 3 days, it may be worth the pay for a generator to keep you up and running. And I can second what these guys are talking about. We've had a lot of risks that have generators, and they're diesel powered, that's awesome, but they never run them, they never turn them on, they never turn them over. When they lose power, nobody knows how to turn the thing on. And it didn't do them any good.
Yep. Looks like you had a question over there. I don't know if you.
Sure. Yes, go ahead, Howie.
I think the airports also on southeastern North Carolina or all along the coast, we have something else that we have to look at. It's rust and corrosion because of the salt water. Those generators just don't have the longevity that they would have if they're in Raleigh or an example like that.
Very
And that's
true.
You've run into that issue. We've run into that issue. That's an important issue.
It's a big issue because we have the same situation with our infrastructure. It takes a toll with the salt air and the other conditions down there. And you think about regional challenges. Certainly the corrosive elements are there. High wind ratings, making sure that stuff is protected and shielded so that it can do. And then we talked about flooding. And I don't know on your sites. I mean, I would imagine there's a lot of zoning and siting, but keep in mind, we had substations that have worked fine for 60 years and all of a sudden were flooded and covered up. So take time to look at that, be thinking about your systems, be thinking about as you make upgrades, are you upgrading to the conditions in which you operate? in your region. So I think that's a good point.
And,
So-
and I'll add in the HVAC systems too.
Oh, yeah.
Because working a lot in Florida and stuff, I see people, the HVAC's down, so we opened up all the doors. All your electronics are going to junk because they're exposed to salt air too. So you need to keep everything really well maintained in those harsh environments.
Yep.
I've got a comment here in regards to some of this resiliency and reliability. Contributing comment. I actually visited an airport about 5 years ago, or actually less than 5 years ago, up north, outside North Carolina. I'm not going to name names. Where planning is very important with resiliency. The airport had a single vault for multi-runway airports. No installed generator, just a generator plug installed right next to a fuel farm, right next to the substation. That's not inside the controlled fence line of the airport. So just out of curiosity, what would your recommendations be for that type of airport and their next plans to fix that?
I'll be biased. I'll say hire a reliability engineer and do some system analysis, just like you do in the airplane, the aviation. Your electric beside your fuel, somehow you need to get that separated.
Yep.
And just because you've got two of something, if they're side by side, there's still a single point of failure. And that really analysis needs to be done, and not my typical design brethren. They just throw in things and think multiple parts means more reliability or more redundancy, and it doesn't. So I would hire a pro to look at that situation.
Well, and you know, the utility, if it's a utility-owned substation there, I mean, the utility has to be able to access their equipment, but they can work with the facility to say, you know, they can work with the facility to figure out ways to access that and also be able to maintain, you know, security to whatever degree you need. With larger facilities or medium-sized facilities, we can even look at ways to as needed to do loop systems or backfeeds where we can have redundant ways to reroute power, especially if there's already lines in those areas around a lot of our airport facilities. I think Wilmington's one of them, some others. I know Greensboro, we're building some self-healing capabilities right around there because it is in an area that already has lots of power lines. So it's not that difficult to bring another feed in from another substation. So yeah, so there's a lot of options, but again, you have to kind of talk to the utility from that standpoint and see what their requirements would be versus what they can do to keep your security as well. Obviously, we have to respect the secure zones at your facilities as well.
We've got about 10 more minutes. Do we have some more questions?
He's got,
Insurance in regards to planning of all those systems that are all close together. So if fuel farm goes, that might hit the electric vault that serves the airfield lighting, which then now takes your airfield down during inclement weather or a non-VFR situations. So yeah, just out of curiosity, that impact insurance?
Oh, absolutely will impact the insurance, and that's the interesting part. So when the engineers go out for insurance, it's just the loss control inspectors you see. They're going to say, there's a higher likelihood of a really significant loss now because all of this is right here in one spot. So the backup that was supposed to help us now is going to be taken out if you lose the fuel farm or whatever. And so just like they look at this building here, like this building here is sprinklered. I know it because you see those little circles on the ceiling, that's covering up the sprinkler head up there. So it's a frame building, older frame building, right, but it's sprinklered. Okay, so the likelihood of a total loss is reduced because of that. So you pay a lower rate, therefore you pay a lower premium. And that's what the insurance companies look at. The probability of a really big loss, more likelihood of a bigger loss, the more you pay. So right on the coast in Carolina versus in the middle of the country. You're going to pay more for your property insurance because you have to deal with things like hurricanes that you don't necessarily have to deal with in the middle of the country, although you might have tornadoes and hailstorms. So it's all the higher probability of a really bad event happening and a large loss, the more you pay. And the engineers, if they saw that same scenario, would say, no, separate stuff. I'll give you an easy example. People right by their furnaces or HVAC system, it's usually a big room. We need some storage space. Let's throw all the used rags and the propane and the paint in there by the furnace. Oh, don't do that, because it just takes out the building and causes a big old fire. But we see that more often than not. They use space, or they're like, well, this is the exit way for the people to get out, but it's a big open area, so now it becomes a junk area, and people can't get outdoors. You can lose lives. So that's where insurance really focuses on, okay, if we want to preserve the property and preserve people's lives, how do we basically take exposures and separate them? That's exactly what JD was saying.
and I think this, and it's insurance is a key part of any risk management program or any resiliency program, but you can't insure your way out. And I find a lot of people that believe that, and you just can't. Most of you know that, you've got the ultimate responsibility for your operation and you just can't transfer that risk away. It's yours. And so that's where I would start, is that regardless of insurance, you're going to get it right, whatever that is.
And I will add to that, in terms of risk management and looking at your facilities, we have to also remember that normally at an airport, you have multiple tenants. You're the landlord, and you have people who use your facility with their own employee groups, their own corporate policies, and it is really important in that conversation before the storm to have a relationship, to be able to communicate your plan, overall plan, so that they can comply with that, or they can adopt yours, or they can look at the corporate checklists that they have, so that everything is covered, so that you don't have a piece of the building that you need to go in and look at and sort of regulate well in advance of the storm. You need that partnership well in advance to get everybody on board.
I think you make a really good point, because as I was listening to everybody talk, the other thing that keeps coming back to my mind is that resiliency isn't just equipment. Resiliency isn't just a policy, it's a process. And if you think about a facility that maybe does have an FBO or something else that you got there that's over here, and then you've got a commercial side over here, you've got, whatever, and that facility gets disrupted, how do you readjust, to your point, all the tenants who are there, all the processes, so that everybody can do the emergency things they need to do if they need to do that? And it might even involve rearranging how people work, where they go, what facility is the one facility we're going to keep the power on for, and that's where everything moves to. And then how does that happen? Because the last thing you want to do is have everybody fighting over who gets priority and who gets this or that when you're in the middle of a situation like that. And really, a lot of that is just taking some time. It doesn't have a lot of cost to it, as much as thinking through the process for how you rearrange your operations in a resilient kind of situation.
Are there any other questions in the group? Yes, Jack.
So, all three things that you guys are focusing on. Reliability, resilience, asset management, and insurance. Airports, big or small, it doesn't matter. There's a finite amount of funding that you have available to you. So from your all's experience, how do you balance those things? Because you're not going to be able to do all of it all at one time, especially if you're trying to come from behind and enhance facilities, make the resilience better. How would you advise an airport to do that? And what would that balance look like?
You need to know, and again, it's a lot more complicated. You look at asset management as a management strategy. It's a lot of 30-some-odd steps and whatnot, and we inundate people. What do you own? What condition it's in? What's it worth? I think you start there. And then you have to get into those critical systems that you think are most important with a criticality analysis, or you just brainstorm in small systems and say, what do we do about the one thing, the biggest thing in each category, the two biggest things in each category? And you let the rest of it go. I hate to say, part of risk management is certain things fail. It's a compliance type thing or prevention type strategy says we're going to save everything. When you say I go to a risk-based approach, you're admitting that some things are important than others. And so I think the smaller you are, or the less resources you've got to sort through what's most important and attack that. And that's hard, I know. Asset management, and I'll send you a paper, but asset management fails not because of the physical systems, but because of organizational capacity. Mm-hmm. You've got to have structure and discipline to keep this going, and most organizations don't. And that's why we fail at asset management so much.
And I think our industry is struggling with that now, because during the pandemic, although this is not talking about the pandemic, but in the pandemic, so many of our revenue streams fell out of the bottom. So a lot of us cut some of those capital programs. We cut some of those things that we didn't have to have. We went to the bare bones of what do we need to plan for next year's capital improvements or next year's systems replacement. So now we're going to have a couple years of catch-up to get back to that routine asset management and routine capital program replacement, just because we didn't have the cash that we were holding on to see how long this pandemic is going to last. So I think there's going to be a lot of catching up to do, really.
Yeah, and I would say that resiliency is a journey. So it's not necessarily you're going to have everything solved in year one when you sit down and do all this. there's going to be risk for a little while, and that risk is going to diminish with the more things you can do. I think about our grid improvement strategy. The one we're working on now is a 3-year strategy. So we know that there's places we're not going to get to until next year or the year after. And so there is some inherent risk there. But with each improvement you're making, you're reducing the risk profile of your system, if you will. And I kind of come back to that, you know, it's a broad statement, but be creative in the sense of if your facility by itself doesn't have the budget or the means to do that, consider partnering with your county, or considering partnering with your municipality, considering partnering with other groups that also need that resilient facility. And maybe there's a way that you can, you know, I remember Irma, we used an airport as a staging site for our crews. So, you know, having our crews at a facility gave us a justification for that facility to also be resilient. So there might be some ways that you can use those other means or partnerships. Heck, there might even be, with the new infrastructure things, there might even be grants out there. You know, there's things that are coming. So, but you got to be on the lookout for them, and you're not going to be on the lookout for them if you're not thinking about resiliency, and you're not, you know, it's kind of a domino effect as you go. But yeah.
Yeah, and there's some things you can do that are not really costly. Let's go back to simple examples, right? You only have X amount of dollars in your budget. So if you can maintain your buildings and your equipment, and I'm saying maintaining them, right, through the annual service of the HVAC system, simple things like that, you might be able to get an extra year or 2 or 3 out of that system because it's running really well. So if you keep your physical plant in good shape, routine maintenance, and if you have a good quality staff, like we're here with the Disney discussion earlier, just keep your premises in good condition. Don't store all your flammables by the furnace. Don't block your exit way. I mean, they sound, you laugh, right? It's silly. Don't have extension cords plugged all over the airport running 17 things. That's an electrical fire waiting to hazard. Right. Those are easy things you can do to manage it, and as insurance carriers over time, if you go a long period of time without having losses, you'll end up getting a lower premium. The question, you know, eventually you get lower premiums. Insurance companies don't mind paying losses, but if you have a frequency of losses, you're now over here in this category where your price is going to be high for a long period of time. So boring is good in insurance. You want to not have a frequency of claims. You want to have enough coverage. If the bad thing happens, the insurance company's happy to pay the claim and you know, rebuild your building, replace the assets. But just simple things you do every day make it much more safe. And you think about walking through airports. How many times have you seen cords over the area where passengers are walking by? That's a slip-fall accident waiting to happen. That's probably unnecessary.
I wanted to follow just one thing Jeff reminded me of was the communication part of this. And it's back to what I said in the beginning. A lot of your boards are not going to understand what even risk management means or what a risk is. It's not I gave you that simple one, surprises. But if you don't have the resources to do everything, your job with your board has got to be better, and the public, with the education. And a lot of times you need to explain it like, we're going to have a lot more surprises because we had to cut back because of COVID. Surprises, variations, whatever, take that buzzword and strip it down and make it something they can all relate to, because that really is what it is. We're going to be surprised more often, or you're going to be surprised more often because I can't do this. If I had more money or more resources, I could do this, but because of that, it takes 3 years or 5 years to get there. You've got to be prepared as my customer or as my board to have more surprises. And I know I've been on the private side and the public side, so I've reported to elected officials. So it is a tough thing to do, but that is the magic of this, some of it.
Well, thank you. Again, great conversation from Jeff, JD, and Rob. We thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us so that we can be better prepared for whatever disaster might be around the corner.